All right, hello everyone. So I'm starting to see a lot of familiar faces at these events. That makes me happy. Happy to be here today. We're here to talk about the research that Texas Pacific has done in the field of beneficial reuse. That's a little bit of my background. I'm a water scientist. I specialized in geology and then kind of dabbled in chemistry. Ended up working in water treatment and found myself in oil and gas doing produced water recycling for Texas Pacific. Some background on Texas Pacific: it's a subsidiary of the Texas Pacific Land Corporation. The Land Corporation is a large landowner in the Permian Basin. They own about 900,000 acres of land, which gives us access to quite a bit of produced water. Texas Pacific Land started the Texas Pacific Water Resources Division in 2017 to take a more active land management approach and manage the water resources on that surface. In that time since then, we've built one of the largest water transfer networks through the Permian Basin, a large network of brackish water wells, and we also began our produced water treatment division at that time as well. The land position that we have gives us access to about 5 million barrels of produced water a day. That's about 644 acre feet. We don't directly touch all of that, but we do because of our active management process, we negotiate in contracts to have offtake from SWDs that are positioned on Texas Pacific land surface, which gives us access to quite a bit of water to either recycle or sell or include in this beneficial reuse project. So this is a photo of one of Texas Pacific's traditional recycling facilities within oil and gas. As y'all have heard today, we have an average of 4-to-1 water to oil ratio that's climbing, I think, on an annual basis. Of the approximately 20 million barrels a day of produced water that we generate, only about 25 to 30% of it is reused within oil and gas. To put that volume into perspective, like Mike mentioned with Albuquerque, this is about 3 times the amount of water that the city of Austin uses on a daily basis. So for a job like this, where we're recycling within oil and gas, and I know some of you know this already, we've been recycling for a while, what we focus on here is really removing things like iron, H2S, oil, some scaling elements like barium and strontium. But for the most part, the salt in this water stays about the same. So the water that we see in these sites is anywhere from 80,000 to 160,000 parts per million. When it comes into that site and when it leaves that site, that doesn't change. But it doesn't really need to change within oil and gas. So what we've done now that we have spent about 5 years developing these processes, we started looking into desalination, more for brackish water, because we are a water supplier in Reeves County, and a lot of the groundwater in Reeves County is starting to climb. It's climbed over the past 5 years from an average of 5,000 to 6,000 to some of the wells that we have now are in the 14,000 range, which is not acceptable to some operators. And so that kind of led us down the desalination track originally, and this was in 2020. As far as the recycling within oil and gas, I get a lot of people ask, well, why don't we just recycle all of it within oil and gas? And as Ryan mentioned earlier, a lot of operators have switched to 100% produced water fracs. The problem is just that when we use produced water for fracking, we receive almost 3 to 4 times that back. That needs a solution. And currently, right now, what we're doing is disposing of that water. We know now from what we see in the environment in Reeves and Loving, Culberson area, that disposal is not going to be that long-term solution because of the amount of water that we have. So these numbers are from B3. They're predicting that produced water volumes will outnumber the demand by 60% within the next 2 years. And that 60% is the water that us as an industry are trying to figure out what to do with, which led Texas Pacific to what we call the age of opportunity. So what you can see in the top slide, Texas Pacific started doing beneficial reuse in 2023, which is this top one here. This is our greenhouse. And we've continued doing it now. This bottom one is alfalfa right after germination. So the options currently that we have from a beneficial reuse standpoint are pretty limited. We have the land application that is permitted through the Railroad Commission. That is currently a pilot permit, so it's not designed to be a long-term, large-scale project. It's a one-year permit so that we can figure out the right way to do this. It's my understanding that the Railroad Commission is still learning from these pilots as more of them come online. Those permits are, the siting requires quite a bit of regulation in reference to groundwater, run-on, runoff, the amount of water that you can apply. There's a pretty rigorous testing protocol of over 350 analytes that we've participated in over the past 2 to 3 years. There are effluent limitations stated as Mike showed earlier, and it requires a neighboring control plot, so that allows us to compare what we see from the produced water irrigation or treated produced water irrigation to the control. The other option is a TIPDES, or NIPDES as some call back and forth. It's a discharge elimination system that is what Ryan was referring to, that would discharge to a surface water of Texas. The other that is not mentioned here, in I believe 2 years ago, House Bill 4856 gave TCEQ also it clarified their authority to regulate aquifer recharge with treated produced water. There's not an existing permit structure for that yet, but it is something that we're also looking into. And then industrial use, which is favorable to most people, but I think that still is going to require some research, all of which is currently underway. We're trying to figure out any ways that we can use this on the industrial side for uses still within oil and gas, but there are limitations to that due to the waste label that this water will carry until it is discharged into a surface water body of Texas. So this is the path that Texas Pacific took starting in 2023. In 2023, we began looking into different methods of desalination, all of which were very expensive. That kind of led us to develop our own method in-house. What we know is that there are many ways to desalinate water, and there's many ways that are very good at desalinating water that are below 25,000 parts per million. We have seawater ROs, we have brackish water ROs that are all very successful in removing a lot of the contaminants that are in the water, if not all of them, especially when followed with activated carbon. So what we did was we developed a technology that could at least get us to somewhere where we can use an established technology like reverse osmosis and activated carbon, so that we knew if there was leftover things in this water after our pre-treatment, like I showed in the first slide, and after our desalination step, that it would go to a reliable, trusted, established method like an RO. In August of 2023, there wasn't a pilot program set up yet, so we decided to start with the greenhouse. In 2023, we set up a greenhouse. We took soil from Loving County and Reeves County, irrigated alfalfa and a lot of different native plants with different qualities of treated water, some blended, some straight out of the RO, and one from a control, which was a drinking water RO in Midland, Texas. We used the data from that greenhouse, and I'll show you a more detailed slide of that greenhouse in the next slide. We used the data from that greenhouse to then apply for the Railroad Commission pilot permit that was operational this year. It's still going on. It's probably going to go on until about November when that alfalfa starts going dormant. And the Railroad Commission pilot guidance was out by that time, so that's what we used, and we were able to also tailor our greenhouse experiment to some of the things that Railroad Commission specified that we look into, or analytes that we didn't originally add. From an achievable water quality standpoint, our system is tailorable to whatever water quality is necessary. We, like I said, were originally looking at irrigation quality, but we realized coming out of the RO that we were also exceeding a lot of the drinking water standards in a positive way. We were doing better than what is regulated for drinking water. which kind of led us down the path of the NIPD's permit and looking into what would be required for surface water discharge. So in the past year and a half, say, we've tested this water at this point now for over 700 different contaminants. Our treatment has been successful in removing about 99% of the anions that are present in that water. Those are going to be things like your chloride, your sulfate, phosphate, nitrate. 95% reduction in metals, and that additional 5% is mostly sodium. And of the VOCs that we tested, only 20% of them we even detected, and of the 20% that we detected, we reduced those by 99.8%. So the water that we're producing from a varying influent is coming out at about 150 to 250 parts per million. The way that we built our first pilot was with the frac tank as the influent, so we were able to bring water in from all different parts of the basin. So we brought in water from Midland, Texas, we brought in 4 different water sources from Reeves, Texas, and we brought in 2 different water sources from Loving. And the reason that we did that is because, as we all know, there's a lot of concern about what's in this water, how do we know what's in the raw water? And the honest answer is we don't know exactly what's in that water at all times because it changes quickly and it changes rapidly. So we wanted to expose our system to a variation of produced waters, all at different salinities with different oil contents, and really focus the analysis on the effluent to make sure that our effluent was staying the same regardless of the incoming water quality. The end-use requirements are different for agriculture versus surface water discharge. What we did is we kind of stepped the water quality down each time. So originally we started with our 1500 water quality, which was a blend of RO, permeate, and concentrate. That was one of the standards that was used in our greenhouse. We looked for contaminants that were present in that water, and there were some. So then we went down a little lower and we went to 1,000. And then we went down a little lower and we added an activated carbon. And then we went to another level and added disinfection so that we could truly see what each step of our process was removing and what was left if we did not have that step. So at this point now, we can confidently say what is required for what in our treatment process would be required for surface water discharge versus irrigation. This is kind of the layout of our land application study. This was the greenhouse layout. So if you look here, we had 4 planter boxes. The top row was Reeves County soil with native plants. The second row was Loving County soil with native plants, and then we had a 4th row, which the boxes were cut in half. It was half Reeves and half Loving, and these had alfalfa. So each row is a different salinity. The first row was 1,500. That was about 1% RO permeate blended with about 99% or 1% RO concentrate blended with about 99% RO permeate. The next one was 1,000. It was less than 1%. We had a 500 TDS that really, we didn't always have to blend concentrate back into, but we did a little bit. And then we had a control which came from the drinking water in Midland. Our system is a 6-step system, so we start with the traditional treatment that I showed in the first slide, which is going to be, it's different depending on what water source you have, how much oil it has in it, how much iron it has in it. Sometimes this can be very simple, and sometimes it's just peroxide, settling, and a filter. Sometimes it's more extensive. It involves dissolved air flotation, flocculation. Those chemicals will range just based on, like I said, what the water quality is. The next step after that, once you achieve less than 10 TPH, less than 0, or less than 1 iron, and a turbidity of 1 or less than 1, then we proceed to the distillation step. Our desalination method is, like I said, we developed it in-house, so we don't like to publicly say it like this, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards if anybody has questions. We landed upon this because it uses about 1/3 of the energy of traditional thermal methods. So our goal is really just to get this water down to a quality that can go into the RO. So we target that quality to be around 25,000. At 25,000, it will go to a seawater RO, and we'll get about about a 60% recovery from that stream. The 40% that is rejected goes back and is blended with the incoming water, just so that we're not putting as big of a load on our system. Sometimes this water comes in anywhere, from 170 to 190, which takes a lot more energy to desalinate. So if we can recover and bring that salinity back down with the water that our RO is rejecting, then we use it in that way. So the only process here that's really generating waste is going to be the desalination step. Our limit for concentrating right now is about 245,000, which, as salinity gets higher in Permian Basin, that's what our recovery rate is dependent on, because of how high we can concentrate that water before we start breaking out salt, solids, some of which we don't want to deal with. So we try and keep that in a fluid that can be sent to disposal. In this study, we irrigated these plants. The native plants were irrigated with about 15 gallons of water per box per week. The alfalfa, to show you the difference in what the uptake of a crop versus a native grass is, the alfalfa got about 50 gallons per week per box. And these boxes are 2.5 feet by 7 feet long and 3 feet deep. That allowed us, before going into the Railroad Commission outdoor study, that allowed us to figure out how much water we can apply to this soil without having pooling on the top. It allowed us to see how deep the soil microbiome is changing, how deep the chemistry is changing, and how much water is uptaken by these plants in the process. We also matched the weather conditions of Midland, Texas in the greenhouse so that we could observe things like evaporation and what effect that had on salt accumulating on the surface, salt accumulating on the plants. So we learned a lot from this study. We took soil samples almost every month. We are analyzing these plants still for bioaccumulation. We've sent them for forage quality analysis. We're looking at the microbiome in the entire soil profile, as well as now we're digging a little deeper into the plant side to see how they metabolize any contaminants that are left in the water. In this study, in the 1500 box, we were actually able to observe what happens if you do leave some contaminants in this water, because the water was blended with some RO concentrate that did still have a detectable level of VOCs and salts. These are the results, just a high-level review, the results that we saw in the greenhouse. So the plants, what you're seeing here is RFV value. This here on the bottom is the scale that they use to price alfalfa, and it's based off of sugar, proteins, stuff like that. What you'll notice is that in the 1,000 box, where we had a small amount of RO concentrate still left in the water, that was actually supreme grade alfalfa. So what we know from this is that leaving a certain amount of these contaminants, or not contaminants, but TDS in the water can actually be good for these plants if we can specify exactly what we are leaving. So things like nitrogen will help these plants, boron, iron, calcium, magnesium. You'll look in the control, which didn't have that, and you can see the RFV value here is a lot lower. The plants are very malnutrited, this is what we would be getting now that we have our outdoor alfalfa plot and we are no longer blending concentrate. Some soil results here. We can see how the sodium absorption ratio increased, obviously more in the 1500 box, but like I mentioned, at an application rate, and these are average values for the alfalfa boxes, not the native plant boxes, because the native plant boxes didn't receive as much water. The alfalfa boxes actually ended up being a lot better indicator to see what we're doing with the soil. TPH levels decreased in every single box because TPH was non-detectable in our effluent, even after blending. So, and we saw this same trend with a lot of different contaminants in the soil. We saw this with different minerals and salt. We were actually washing down these minerals further into the ground as we irrigated, because the water didn't have very many minerals present. This is a kind of an overview of our TIPDES permit. So we've applied also for a TIPDES permit to discharge into a tributary of the Pecos River. The water quality here, as we mentioned, the water quality in the Pecos River here is 9 to 14,000. The Salt Creek, from what we've seen in sampling it, it's not a creek that you can find a lot of data on, but the Salt Creek, we've found areas of up to 30,000 TDS. The creek does not flow very regularly. It's consists of small pools along more of a drainage ditch than anything. We're proposing to discharge into this Salt Creek, which then flows into the Pecos River. The Salt Creek was chosen because of its proximity to our operations and our ability to offtake, produce water in that area. As far as quality, like I mentioned, the creek is about 30,000. The quality that we're targeting to go into that creek is 3,000 to 4,000. But what we know from our original analysis during the greenhouse is that when you say, well, it's cheaper to get the water only down to 3,000, or it's cheaper to only get the water down to 5,000, that's true, but it does still leave quite a few contaminants. So what we are going to be doing is actually going down below the level that those contaminants are detected, which for us is about 150 to 200 parts per million, and then we'll have to actually be adding salt and alkalinity back to this water before it can go into the tributary. These are just some pictures of the site. This is our effluent here. This is our produced water plot that Mike showed earlier. There's still a lot of research being done on this plot, but initially the plot has been growing since about March or April. In our preliminary analysis, what we're seeing is that the alfalfa that is grown in the produced water plot, even though it looks very similar to the control plot, and it from a protein standpoint and a forage value standpoint, they are the same. This alfalfa is actually grossly under-nutriated, I guess you would say, than the control, which is watered by groundwater. So from a biomass standpoint, if you take a square foot of alfalfa from here versus a square foot of alfalfa from the control, it's actually 30 to 40% less because of the lack of nutrients. So we know that leaving some nutrients in there is helpful. In these pilot studies, we don't use fertilizers, we don't use pesticides. So if you see a lot of things in that box that don't look like alfalfa, that's why we want to truly observe just the water alone and what effect that has. And on the preliminary, it looks like our water might actually be a little bit too clean and will require some fertilizer or will require adding things back like ammonia and minerals. The plant size is also being considered. This study is done in conjunction with Texas Tech as well as New Mexico State. So we've been working with New Mexico State and the New Mexico Produced Water Consortium to do a lot of initial wet testing, non-target analysis, human cell line analysis, plant bioaccumulation analysis, microbiome of the soil. And we're now working with Texas Tech on this project to actually look into the crop a little bit deeper as a whole and then look into the soil. The soil here was brought in from Lubbock, and so it was a somewhat fortified soil. It had cattle on it for a while, so it had a lot more nutrients present than what we saw in the greenhouse. And we do intend to publish that data with New Mexico. We're hoping to get 2 to 3 publications out of that, one in water quality, the next in our technology and the validation of that technology, as well as the pilot. And with Texas Tech, we're also planning to release what our recommendations are for using produced water to irrigate things like alfalfa. We know that we can use this water for irrigation. There's been a lot of studies that have grown cotton, that have grown sorghum, that have grown alfalfa. I think what we need to figure out now is, if we put this water in a river and you take it out, is there anything that has to be done specifically to it? Are there things that are better? Are there things that are worse? And we get a lot of that input from speaking at things like this and meeting people in the local community. We've invited a lot of people out to see our site on the environmental side as well as the regulatory side and the industry side. We really invite collaboration and questions. So, we've tried to be as open about this process as we can without sharing too much about the technology in a public setting. But yeah, with that being said, I'm happy to take questions.
Have they given you an indication of what you would be required to analyze for the frequency at which you'll have, I'd say, grab samples versus continuous or that type of monitoring?
No, not yet. I think that information is going to be in our draft permit. The one thing that they did hint when they came out to our pilot to tour a couple weeks ago was that wet testing was going to be a very important, very frequent test. So it sounds like we're going to be doing it at least monthly and on a couple different organisms, acute test, and chronic test. As far as all of the other analytes, I haven't heard exactly what that list is going to look like, if it's going to increase or if it's not. But yeah. Yes, I think that we do know that there are microbes that will ingest hydrocarbons. I think it's actually a method for cleaning up diesel spills. But what we see in this water, like I mentioned, the reason that we get it to such a high quality is that if you leave a little bit of something in there that might not be that bad, there might still be a little bit of something in there that is really bad, even if it's in a very small amount. So our approach is to just get almost everything out, aside from trace amounts of sodium and calcium, because we know that once we reduce the VOCs completely, there's not a risk of having harmful contaminants. Anything else? Thanks.